This is the Nikon Z6 III, and it has one major flaw. It's something photographers have talked about non-stop since this camera's release, with some even calling this a deal breaker, saying it makes this camera unusable. But what exactly is this huge flaw? When the Nikon Z6 III was first released, there was a ton of photographers that were excited for the drastic improvements to this camera over the previous generations, with far superior autofocus, faster shooting speeds, and a new design for the Z6 line. But when diving deeper into this camera's performance, photographers noticed the dynamic range underperformed expectations. Actually, scrap that. A lot of photographers said that the dynamic range performance from the Z6 III made it unusable. This led to Nikon facing tons of backlash over this camera and leaving photographers disappointed, despite the massive improvements to the third generation of the Z6 line, which caused photographers to skip a camera they would have otherwise enjoyed. But wait a second, let's first back up and establish what dynamic range is in the first place. In essence, dynamic range is how accurately the camera sensor is able to capture the difference between the brightest and darkest parts of the image. And with better dynamic range comes greater details in both the shadows and the highlights, making it far easier to bring up the shadows if you expose for the highlights while having minimal noise and plenty of details in the shadows. While cameras with poor dynamic range tend to see more noise and loss of details in highlights and shadows. Dynamic range is measured in stops of light, which means more stops equals better dynamic range. And of course, camera sensors will perform differently, and usually having a larger sensor means you'll get better performance. And having great dynamic range is especially important in a niche like landscape photography, as we tend to find ourselves in high contrast scenarios pretty frequently with a bright sky and dark foreground. And having as much dynamic range as possible is crucial for retaining details and ensuring we can edit our image in the way we like. It's one of the most important features that landscape photographers look out for when deciding to pick up a new camera, and it's one that I definitely look at when deciding what to add to my kit. But let's revisit the Nikon Z6 III and find out whether or not all this backlash is justified. And the first numbers we need to look at is peak dynamic range. This is how much dynamic range we get at the best performing ISO. With the Z6 III, we get a peak dynamic range of 10.46, while its predecessor gets 11.26. This accounts for a 7.10% decrease in dynamic range from the Z6 II to the Z6 III. This is a pretty big difference between the two cameras, accounting for almost an entire stop of dynamic range. However, once we get to ISO 800, the Z6 III and Z6 II are neck and neck, with very similar performance from this point forward. So it really is just those lower ISOs where this camera struggles, because once we get to those higher ISOs, we can see that this camera is on par with other cameras in the same class. This does suck for landscape photography though, as we tend to shoot everything at an ISO of 100 and can affect other niches that rely on low ISOs for the best dynamic range performance. Of course, we can say all we want about dynamic range when it comes to the numbers, but I think we should actually take a look at the images and compare two images shot in the exact same way from two different cameras to see how bad the dynamic range actually is. And the camera that I will be comparing the Z6 III to is the original Z6, and the reason I'm doing that is because I own a Z6 and I can make those direct comparisons a lot easier, and plus the Z6 is only 0.1 stops worse in terms of dynamic range relative to the Z6 II, so I think it would make a great comparison. So let's go right into the studio and actually take a look at two images that were shot in pretty much the exact same way. I use the exact same exposure, so f8 1/25 of a second, ISO 100, so we can test out the base ISO of both of these cameras. And the only difference was that the white balance was slightly off, so I made it a little even. So it was actually quite dark. We exposed for the highlights here, and we made sure to keep some of that detail in there. So this is a really great place to actually test out what those shadows look like. And for this comparison, we have the Z6 on the left-hand side and the Z6 III on the right-hand side. And you really have a hard time telling a lot of the differences here in terms of dynamic range performance. One thing that we do see is that the Z6 III actually had a little bit of a difficult time bringing up those shadows. It's a lot brighter in this area over here with the original Z6. And I think the dynamic range definitely has a part in that. It just looks a lot cleaner on the Z6 side. It looks a lot more desaturated on the Z6 III. The noise difference is not as great as I thought it was gonna be. I mean, if we take a look at, let's just say right here, we can see that the color shifts a little bit towards the greener side on the Z6 III. And we actually, you know what? We do see some of that detail pickup. Let's just say right here, we can see that it's a little bit softer on this side. It's not a massive difference, but you can definitely tell if you are pixel peeping. And if we take a look at how dark this was, this is probably underexposed by like 2-ish stops. And you can just see that detail is a lot nicer on the Z6 side. I think the biggest thing to me is that detail. We do just see more detail on the Z6 relative to the Z6 III, and that is expected for a camera that is going to have more dynamic range. We're talking about maybe a 2 stops difference between the Z6 and the Z6 III. If we go up to these trees here, on this side here with the Z6 III, we see less of this texture right up the middle here where it's darker, whereas on the Z6, it comes back a little bit nicer. It's just a little bit brighter, a little bit punchier, a little more detail. And again, it's really not by much. I think this tree is actually a great example. This is where you kind of see some of that color noise come in. I mean, it's really minimal. The noise actually isn't too bad. I really do think it is the detail where you're gonna see most of the dynamic range difference. Now, one other comparison I want to see was actually if we brought up just an area with high amounts of shadows, what would that look like in terms of the difference? So let's go ahead and unhide these. And so I brought this area up by about 3.25 stops. So that is a lot. So that's probably accounting for like a 5-stop increase between, you know, increasing the exposure and also increasing the shadow area. And you can see here on the Z6 III, we're just going to get more noise relative to the Z6, and a lot more color noise is introduced. You can see this more green shifted is much more prevalent on the Z6 III versus the Z6. We are seeing more noise again, and I think that's just a testament to the dynamic range itself. If you take a look at this small sliver right here versus this small sliver, you can see that this thing kind of gets blown out. It's a little bit difficult to make out what exactly that is, versus right here, we can see that there's more detailed, more defined edges. And I think this is a really great testament to the dynamic range because this is the darkest parts of the image. Now, when it comes back to the actual like highlight detail, I actually kind of feel like the Z6 III does a little bit of a better job at retaining that highlight detail. So if we zoom in here, we can see that it's just a little bit hotter on the Z6 side relative to the Z6 III. Again, it's really not that drastic of a difference, but it is slightly noticeable if you are pixel peeping. And to me, I think the Z6 III actually does a good job when it comes to that highlight detail. And actually, I kind of feel like this is an area that it actually excels in relative to other cameras in its price range. Again, it's not a drastic difference, but it is definitely noticeable when you are pixel peeping to the fullest extent. And I just feel like a lot of those big differences when it comes to dynamic range is really going to come down to that detail and the shifting in the color noise in particular, because we are going to see a slight shift more to that green side and a little bit of a loss of detail, more so relative to other cameras in the same price range. And I think it's really interesting to see that comparison because to me, you know, when you think about increase in dynamic range, you think a lot about just increase in noise in general. But we're not seeing too bad of an increase in noise, actually. It's not that bad. It's more just that loss of detail and that shift to the green tint. So now that we've seen like what exactly those differences are when it comes to performance for dynamic range, we kind of have to ask ourselves, why is the Z6 III like this? The entire reason for the Z6 III's fatal flaw has to do with the new and improved sensor. You see, the Z6 III implemented a partially stacked sensor, and this completely changes the game. Because with a stacked sensor, we'll see major improvements with how fast the camera can process light, which helps reduce rolling shutter when using the electronic shutter, meaning we get less of the jello effect when shooting fast-moving subjects. It's also helped with autofocus by being more confident and sticky on your subject. It's a great improvement for those who shoot lots of action. But for those of us who don't shoot a lot of action, this can be kind of detrimental because the increased readout speed actually hurts the dynamic range. Even though the sensor can now read out fast, this leads to the sensor struggling to accurately capture the full range of light values, leading to decreased dynamic range overall, which sucks for landscape photographers, as we'll see less details retained in the shadows and highlights. And although we're mainly talking about the Z6 III in this video, this is a very common theme across the board for all stacked sensor cameras. This includes the 45 megapixel cameras, which are the Z7 II versus the Z8, where the peak dynamic range from the Z7 II is at 11.6, while the Z8 is at 11.32. Now this might not seem like a huge difference, but simply showcases the differences between the stacked versus traditional sensor when it comes to dynamic range. It doesn't necessarily mean that having a stacked sensor is bad for photography, but rather means that if you want that faster readout speed, you're gonna have to compromise dynamic range for it. In this video, we've talked a lot about the Nikon Z6 III and its performance on paper, but after using this camera for the past year, I want to give you guys what it's actually like working with a camera's image quality in the real world. Because it's not enough just to get a bunch of tests on paper and call it a day. We have to look at the images holistically to get a better idea. As I've hinted quite a bit in this video, I shoot mainly landscape photography with the Z6 III. This means that I'm shooting a lot in high contrast scenarios with a low ISO, which is a situation that the Z6 III is said to struggle in. And what I found is that the camera will tend to have a tough time in those extreme circumstances, like this photo here. In the unedited version, we can see these trees being pretty dark with not that much light on them. And as we bring the edited photo into the mix, we'll find the trees look soft with the branches and leaves starting to mesh together with some noticeable noise. There is also some color shifting happening, and it's prevalent in this tree here, where it shifted slightly green. This is quite an extreme example, as this was during the sunrise and the shadow casted was pretty harsh. I do think overall the image looks fine, and it's not until you start pixel peeping where you notice where the dynamic range has an effect on the image. And this is a pretty common experience for me. Even in high contrast scenarios, you really need a pixel peep in order to see the difference. Overall though, the dynamic range has been fine for what I shoot, and as long as I'm making sure I craft as even exposure as possible, I come out with photos that are flexible and quite easy to work with. And after shooting thousands of photos with the Z6 III, there hasn't been any moments where I throw away photos simply because the dynamic range couldn't keep up. You have to remember too that these high contrast scenarios are far and few between. It's not something you're constantly dealing with, and even if you are, it's workable with the Z6 III. And in those situations where the exposure tends to be a bit more even, the dynamic range performs just fine and comes out with plenty of detail to work with. To me, the dynamic range never felt like a hindrance and was the reason why the Z6 III wasn't able to capture my images on a landscape shoot. And if you want to see me edit photos from the Z6 III, then you should check out my Patreon. I just got back from San Francisco, where I spent a week running around and taking photos mainly with my Z6 III. So check it out and see how the dynamic range was able to perform. At the end of the day, dynamic range isn't the only factor that affects the image quality. Other aspects like color accuracy and image processing definitely affect how the images look, because we can have a sensor that produces top of the line dynamic range but processes unflattering photos that feel lifeless. This is largely because dynamic range is a very quantitative factor where you can really only measure it by numbers, where the other components are very qualitative and very subjective to the photographer's eye. And to me, Nikon excels in these other components across the camera line. And with the Z6 III lacking in dynamic range, we have to turn to the other elements to evaluate the image quality holistically. In my opinion, the Z6 III delivers excellent photos that look great straight out of camera and pop with so much vibrancy and a gorgeous feel to the images. Everything from skin tones to how the blues and greens look feel very natural and lifelike. While the camera does struggle in super high contrast scenarios because of the dynamic range, I never felt hindered by it. Even though dynamic range is one of the most important factors that I look for in a camera, I didn't feel like it was a massive deal breaker for me when I picked up the Z6 III. There were so many great improvements to the camera that made it all worth it to me, like the new and improved vertical interface, improved grip and size, pixel shift, and so many more features that made it a massive upgrade from the Z6. Unfortunately, there isn't a perfect camera, but I do think it is kind of unfair to look at the Z6 III's dynamic range and dismiss the rest of the camera because of this one factor. I still think it's a great camera no matter what you're shooting, and is one of the best in class compared to the other cameras in a similar price range. For me, moving forward, it will still be my main camera body for landscape photography, and I absolutely expect it to keep on delivering great images no matter what situation it's thrown into. But what do you think about the Z6 III and its dynamic range performance? Is it a deal breaker for you, or is this something that you can kind of work around? Let me know down in the comment section down below. Anyways guys, thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today, and if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to check this one out right here. There's no card in here. I try to look at the photos, but there's no card.